This morning we'd like to draw your attention to Ezekiel chapter 11 and beginning with verse 19. As Ezekiel is talking about the wonderful grace of God, God, speaking of the captives that were in Babylon and throughout the world, said, I will give them one heart, and I will put a new spirit within them, and I will take away the stony heart out of their flesh, and I will give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my ordinances and do them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. As we look at the history of the nation of Israel, first of all, we marvel at all that God had done for them. He brought them out of their bondage in Egypt. He destroyed the pursuing Egyptian army. He led them through the wilderness, and there he provided for them manna day by day and water out of the flinty rock. He had given them his perfect law, the commandments, the statutes, the judgments. These were the rules for a good life. And if they would follow them, God promised that they would live a life of peace, of happiness, and of prosperity. David had declared concerning the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. The statutes of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. And the judgments of the Lord, they are true and they are righteous altogether. More to be desired are they than gold, yea, than much fine gold, and in keeping of them there is great reward. Again, in Psalm 1, David said, if a person would meditate upon the law of the Lord, that they would be like a tree that's planted by the rivers of living water, bringing forth fruit in their season. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he does will prosper. A good, long, prosperous life. These are the rules that God has given, that we might enjoy a good, long, prosperous life. He gave to them the land that he had promised to Abraham that he would give to his descendants. He had driven out their enemies from before them. He helped them subdue the land, and then he prospered them abundantly in the land. That's what God had done for them. In turn, this is how they provoked the Lord. They had turned their backs upon God. They had ceased worshiping him. They had cast his commandments aside. The very first commandment was, thou shalt have no other gods before me. But they began to worship the gods of the pagans around them. They began to make little idols of stone and wood, which represented their gods. And they had become pagan and forsaken the worship of God. Sex had become one of their chief gods. Their minds had become absorbed with their sexual passions. Money and possessions have become a god to them. They set their goal to be rich. They were willing to lie, to cheat, to steal, or do whatever it took to get rich. Power had become a god to them. The desire to control others, and then pleasure, one of the major gods, and they began to live solely for pleasure. They had turned their backs upon the true and the living God. They really wanted nothing to do with him. They did not want to retain the thought of God in their minds. They wanted to be liberated from the law of God, which they looked upon as restraining them from their pursuit of their other gods. They wanted to sin freely without the feeling of guilt. That's a big hue and cry in our world today. The psychologists have told us of the problems that can develop when we have a guilt complex. And so the goal of our modern society is to liberate people from any kind of feelings of wrong. And they say that everything is just relative, so that you can do whatever you see to be right, and you don't have to feel guilty for it, because if it's right to you, then it is right to you, and do it. Don't feel guilty. Because they had turned from God, God endeavored to keep them from destroying themselves with the evil practices that they had taken up. And so God began to allow them to experience national disasters. They were mild to begin with, but they became gradually more severe. And they would call upon the Lord in the time of their distress. He would deliver them from the oppression of their enemies, and then they would turn from the Lord, and they would forsake him. He again would allow them to be taken captive, let their enemies defeat them, and again they would call upon the Lord, and he would deliver them. The pattern continued for hundreds of years. They're turning away from God and beginning to worship false gods. The resulting national problems, they're turning back to God and being helped and prospered. And in their prosperity, forgetting God and again beginning to worship the false gods, leading again to national problems, and in their distress, turning back to God and being delivered and blessed. And this became a pattern that repeated itself over and over again ad nauseum. But every time they would go down, they would go a little lower. Every time they would try to rise, they wouldn't quite rise to the previous heights, so that the total trend was downward as they were going away from God. Now, God had sent prophets to warn them and to call them to turn back to God, and told them the consequences of their sins, what it would do to them if they continued in their evil ways. But they did not want to hear the true prophets of God, so they beat them, they imprisoned them, and they actually stoned many of them. They wanted to sin freely without the feelings of guilt, and they sought to stop the prophets from declaring their message. I see the very same attitude developing in our worlds today. People don't want to hear about sin. They don't want to hear about the judgment of God that is going to come against sin. They don't want to hear about sin when they go to church. They don't want to hear that nasty four-letter word, hell, or be warned that those that continue in sin will surely spend eternity in hell apart from God. They would rather hear soothing words, the words of the false prophets who speak about a loving God who would never, of course, send anybody to a place as horrible as hell. They want to be able to go on in their sin and no need to fear the judgment of God that will come against sin. They would rather just hear about keep smiling and keep a positive attitude. It's interesting that the major movement in the church today is to develop a seeker-friendly atmosphere, to make no mention of sin, no mention of the judgment of God, and to entertain the people. Let them enjoy their experience in church without any feelings of guilt. As time went on, the nation Judah continued to sink deeper and deeper into their wickedness until the judgment of God finally came. Now, it's interesting to me, when God brought his final judgment, he did it in segments that were separated by years. In other words, it wasn't just woof, cut off. But in 607 BC, the Babylonians came. They conquered the city of Jerusalem, and they took a few captives back to Babylon. Some of the brightest, most promising young men that they might train in the schools in Babylon, that they might become counselors to Nebuchadnezzar. But life pretty much went on as usual in Jerusalem, and the people continued in their sin. So, in 595 BC, the Babylonians came again. And this time, the judgment against Jerusalem was a little harsher. They had taken more captives from Jerusalem, and in this captivity, included in it, was Ezekiel the prophet. But again, the people would not turn to God. They continued in their path of evil, and so the Babylonians came back in 586 BC, and they wiped out Jerusalem completely. They left no one alive. They destroyed the temple. They destroyed the walls. They burned the city, and it was the end. But God was so gracious. He gave them warnings before the judgment came. And I believe that God does give warnings before his great judgment comes. I believe that 9/11 was a warning to the United States, and that we, for a time, heeded the warning. The Senate got out on the steps and actually sang, "God bless America." And they acknowledged God. But soon we lapsed back into that sort of careless attitude towards God and the things of God. And I believe that we're going to have another warning. How long will God put up? I don't know. How long will God be easy on us? I don't know. But if we don't turn, if we don't repent, you can be sure that God's judgment will fall upon America just as it did on Judah.